Life had been quieter since my husband passed away. The laughter that once echoed through our home felt like a distant memory. We had shared a love for adventure, and our tradition of riding ATVs through the woods was one of the most cherished parts of our lives. After his accident, the thought of riding again felt unbearable. My son, Ethan, 20 years old now and so much like his father in confidence and resilience, never pressed me about it. But I could see it in his eyes, the same longing I felt for the open trails, the freedom of the ride, and the connection it brought. A year passed before I found myself staring at the one ATV we'd kept, now covered in dust. Ethan noticed me lingering and approached with his signature grin. "Mom," he started, his voice gentle, "it's time." I hesitated, but his words stayed with me. That weekend I gave in. "Let's do it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's eyes lit up with a mix of surprise and excitement. He nodded, understanding exactly what I needed, and we spent the evening preparing the ATV, wiping away the dust and memories as we readied it for the trails. The next morning, Ethan insisted on driving while I sat behind him. As the engine roared beneath us, I felt the world melt away. The trees blurred into a sea of motion, and the sun cast long shadows that danced across the ground. I could hear Ethan laughing over the sound of the engine, his joy infectious. I couldn't help but laugh too, feeling a part of myself awaken after so long. When we reached a clearing, he slowed down and finally stopped. He helped me off, and I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me, differently, as though he were seeing someone new. His gaze was thoughtful, almost searching. "You look happy," he said quietly, his voice full of warmth. "I haven't seen you like this in a while." I swallowed hard, caught off guard by his words. It feels good to be out here again," I said. But his eyes held mine, and I realized he saw through my words. He didn't just see me as his mother anymore. He saw a woman rediscovering joy, beauty, and a spark that had been buried under grief. "Thank you for this," I managed, my voice catching. He smiled, his expression serious but kind. "I should be the one thanking you," he replied. "You've been so strong, Mom. I just wanted to remind you how much Dad loved this, and how much he'd want us to keep doing it." His words hit me harder than I expected. I nodded, unable to speak, and pulled him into a hug. In that moment I realized how much he had grown, not just in stature but in understanding. Ethan wasn't just my son anymore. He was a young man, carrying pieces of his father and forging his own path. We stayed in the clearing for a while, just sitting on the grass and talking. Ethan leaned back on his elbows, his gaze on the horizon, but I caught him glancing at me more than once. There was something in his eyes, something unspoken that filled the air between us with warmth and a strange kind of electricity. As we headed back home later, I felt a weight lift, a sense of peace I hadn't known I needed. Ethan drove us back in silence, but his hand brushed mine briefly when he handed me his helmet at the end of the ride. The touch lingered in my mind long after we returned. From that day on, our rides became a new tradition, a way of honoring the past while embracing the present. Ethan and I grew closer with each trail we conquered, each moment shared in the woods. Life still had its challenges, but on those rides, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. Through Ethan's eyes, I wasn't just his mother. I was someone joyful, someone beautiful. In those moments, it was as though he could see the woman I had almost forgotten I could be. The next day we went ATV riding again, but to other equally beautiful places. When we arrived back home, the house felt warmer, almost as if the ride had brought life back into it. Ethan was attentive as he parked the ATV and helped me down, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. He watched me carefully, his expression softer than I'd seen in years. "You know," he said, leaning against the railing of the porch as I unlocked the door, "you looked different out there today. Happier, lighter." I smiled at him a little shyly. "It's been a while since I've felt that way." He tilted his head, his gaze lingering on my face in a way that felt oddly intimate. "You don't just look happy, Mom. You look beautiful." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a warmth spread through me. That's sweet of you, Ethan, I said, brushing past him to open the door. It's not just sweet, he replied, his voice quiet but firm. I mean it. Inside, the house felt cozier than it had in a long time. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows. Ethan followed me into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching as I set my helmet down. His eyes didn't leave me, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. You know, he said after a moment, his voice lightening, we should celebrate today. I mean, it's a big deal, right? Getting back out there. I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? Pizza, he declared with a grin. And a movie night. Come on, it'll be fun. Just like we used to do when I was a kid. I laughed, shaking my head. You're not a kid anymore, Ethan. No, he said, his expression softening again. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy this. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself nodding. All right, I said, pizza and a movie it is. Ethan took charge in the kitchen, insisting that I relax while he handled the cooking. I sat at the table, watching as he moved around with ease, chopping toppings and tossing dough with surprising skill. Where did you learn to do that? Asked, amused. College, he said with a shrug. You wouldn't believe how many times I had to feed myself when the cafeteria was closed. It's survival cooking. Well, I teased, your survival skills seem pretty impressive. He glanced over his shoulder at me, smiling. I had a good teacher. You've always been amazing in the kitchen. The compliment caught me off guard again, and I felt a blush creeping up my neck. I hadn't expected this kind of attention from him, noticing things about me, praising me in ways that felt so thoughtful. It wasn't just pride or admiration. It felt personal. As the pizza baked, we settled on the couch, debating what movie to watch. Ethan scrolled through options, but his focus seemed to shift more to me than the screen. You really do look younger today, he said suddenly, his tone soft. Not just younger. You look radiant. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Ethan, you don't have to flatter me. I'm not flattering you, he said, turning to face me. I'm being honest. You were amazing out there today. I haven't seen you smile like that in so long. His words stayed with me, even as we started the movie and ate pizza together. Ethan's closeness felt new, an intimacy that went beyond the bond we'd always shared as mother and son. There was something about the way he looked at me. His eyes filled with admiration and something deeper, that left me feeling exposed but also cherished. Halfway through the movie, he shifted closer, pulling the blanket over both of us. It was a small gesture, but his hand brushed against mine, sending a spark of warmth through me. Comfortable, he asked, his voice low. Yeah, I said softly, unable to meet his gaze. He didn't pull away, and the silence between us grew heavier. I could feel his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the heat radiating from him. When I finally glanced at him, I found him watching me. His expression unreadable. Ethan, I started, unsure of what I wanted to say. I just want you to know something, he interrupted gently. You're incredible, Mom. Everything you've been through, everything you've done for me. You deserve to feel happy, to feel loved. His words brought a lump to my throat, and I looked away, trying to steady myself. I do feel loved, I said quietly. He reached for my hand, his touch firm but tender. I mean it, he said, his voice unwavering. You're beautiful, and you deserve to be told that every day. The sincerity in his voice left me speechless. I didn't know what to say or how to process the emotions swirling in my chest. All I knew was that in that moment, the bond between us felt stronger than ever, closer, deeper, and filled with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. We stayed like that, close and quiet, for the rest of the evening. The movie played on, but neither of us paid much attention to it. Instead, we sat together, the unspoken connection between us growing in ways I couldn't fully understand but didn't want to question. When the credits finally rolled, Ethan turned to me with a small smile. This was nice, he said. Yeah, I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. As he helped me clean up, his hand brushed against mine again, lingering for just a moment. It was a fleeting touch, but it left me with a warmth that stayed long after he said goodnight and went to his room. Lying in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me. Something between us had changed, and though I wasn't sure what it meant, I knew one thing for certain. Ethan didn't just see me as his mother anymore. He saw me as someone vibrant, someone deserving of love and admiration. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could see that in myself too. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of faint rustling in the kitchen. The house was quiet otherwise, the soft light of dawn creeping through the curtains. As I padded down the hallway and stepped into the kitchen, I saw Ethan at the counter, focused intently on packing sandwiches, a thermos, and other items into a bag. "Morning," I said, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What's all this?" Ethan turned to me with a bright, boyish grin that instantly lifted my mood. "Good morning. I got something planned for us. It's a surprise." I raised an eyebrow, both amused and curious. "A surprise? Should I be worried?" "Not at all," he replied, zipping up the bag with a flourish. "Just get dressed. Something warm and comfortable. You'll love this, I promise." His excitement was infectious, so I nodded and headed back to my room to change. When I returned, Ethan was already at the door, holding the packed bag and his helmet. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said with a laugh. We took the ATV again, and as we sped along the quiet roads, I held onto him tightly. My arms wrapped around his waist, and I couldn't help but notice the strength in his frame. Ethan wasn't the little boy who used to cling to my hand anymore. He had grown into a man, strong, confident, and protective. The realization stirred something in me, a mix of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. After what felt like an hour, we arrived at a breathtaking spot. The hill overlooked a sprawling valley, with rolling fields and distant trees stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying a hint of the wildflowers dotting the landscape. It was stunning, but I could tell Ethan had put thought into every detail. He parked the ATV and immediately got to work, pulling out everything he had packed. In no time, he had a small fire going and a cozy spot set up with a blanket spread out and the thermos placed nearby. His movements were precise, efficient, and filled with care. "You really outdid yourself," I said, sitting down on the blanket as he handed me a steaming cup of tea. "Only the best for you," he said, his voice soft and full of warmth. We spent hours there, talking, laughing, and simply enjoying the peace. Ethan kept a close eye on me, always making sure I was comfortable. He often pulled me into his arms for hugs, his touch gentle yet firm. There was something unspoken in his embrace, something that made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in years. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber, Ethan grew quieter. He watched me as much as he watched the horizon, his gaze tender and thoughtful. "You know," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence, "I brought you here because I wanted to remind you of how beautiful life can be. And how beautiful you are." His words took me by surprise, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Ethan, I mean it," he continued, turning to face me fully. "You're not just my mom. You're strong, kind, and you're radiant." I didn't know what to say. His words lingered in the air between us, heavy with emotion. Before I could respond, Ethan leaned closer, his eyes searching mine. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded without thinking, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, he leaned in and pressed a light kiss to my cheek. It was brief, soft, and yet it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't explain. When he pulled back, his gaze stayed locked on mine, filled with something both thrilling and terrifying. I needed you to know how much you mean to me." His words, the kiss, the way he looked at me, it was all so overwhelming, yet somehow it felt right in that moment. I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you, Ethan," I said softly, my voice trembling with emotion. We stayed there until the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and the fire, but more than that, wrapped in the closeness we had rediscovered. Ethan held me often, his arms a safe and steady presence. By the time we made our way back home, the world felt different. I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. The beauty of the valley, Ethan's gentle care, the way he saw me not just as his mother but as a person deserving of joy and love. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Excitement, confusion, and an undeniable warmth that stayed with me long after the firelight had faded. Something between us had changed, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But one thing was clear. Ethan saw me in a way that no one else had for years, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive again. I turned on my side, staring at the soft glow of moonlight filtering through my window. I thought about how much Ethan had done today, planning everything, driving us there, and making sure I was comfortable the entire time. He had done so much, and I knew he must be exhausted. Without thinking about it for long, I made a decision. I quietly got up and walked down the hall to Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I knocked carefully before peeking in. He was lying on his bed, scrolling through his phone, but he looked up when he heard me. His face softened when he saw me, a small smile curving his lips. "Hey," he said, his voice low and warm. "Couldn't sleep?" I stepped inside, a little nervous but determined. "No, I couldn't. I kept thinking about today. And how much you've done for me. You must be tired." He shrugged, sitting up a little. "I'm fine. It's worth it to see you smile like that." I felt my cheeks flush and crossed the room, sitting on the edge of his bed. "You've done so much after all. Let me do something for you." His brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "A massage. You've been on your feet all day driving. You deserve to rest." He blinked in surprise, but then his smile widened. "You don't have to do this, Mom." "I want to," I insisted, my voice soft but firm. "You took care of me, Ethan. Let me take care of you for once." He seemed to think for a moment before nodding. "'Kay. Thanks." He lay down on his stomach, and I grabbed a small bottle of lotion from the nightstand. Sitting next to him, I began to ease the tension in his shoulders. His muscles held firm under my hands, and I could feel how tense he had been today. As I kneaded his back, his breathing slowed and a soft sigh escaped his lips. "This feels amazing," he murmured, his voice muffled against the pillow. I smiled, glad I could give him even a fraction of the care he showed me. "You deserve this," I said softly, my hands moving down his back, careful to apply just the right amount of pressure. "You've done so much for me, Ethan. More than I can ever thank you for." He turned his head slightly to look at me, his eyes half-lidded with relaxation but filled with something deeper. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. I would do anything for you." His words stung me with warmth, and my hands froze for a moment before I continued. The room was silent except for the sound of his breathing, and the intimacy of the moment seemed almost overwhelming. When I finally finished, I leaned back, my hands resting lightly on his back. "Feeling better?" "Yes." He rolled onto his side, facing me, propped up on one elbow. "Much better," he said in a low, sincere voice. "You're amazing." The way he looked at me then, his eyes filled with admiration and something unspeakable, made my heart race. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, and the air between us seemed to thicken with an inexplicable tension. "Ethan," I began, not knowing what I wanted to say. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face, and his touch sent shivers down my spine. "You're incredible," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." I felt my breath catch as he leaned in slightly, his gaze darting to my lips and back to my eyes. My heart was pounding, but I didn't look away. Instead, I found myself leaning in too, and it was impossible to resist. The kiss was light but sensual. It was both exciting and tender, a moment that seemed to be waiting to happen. When we finally pulled away, his hand rested gently on my cheek, his thumb brushing my skin. "I've wanted to tell you how I feel for so long," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked into his eyes, my own emotions boiling. I don't know what this means, Ethan, I said honestly, my voice shaking. But I know I've never felt anything like this before. He nodded, his face full of understanding. We don't have to figure everything out right now, he said softly. I just want you to know how much you mean to me. How much I care about you. I couldn't find the words to answer, so I leaned in and kissed him again, letting my actions speak for me. In that moment, everything else disappeared, the questions, the uncertainty, the outside world. All that mattered was the connection we shared, the bond that had grown deeper than I ever thought possible. The night passed in quiet closeness, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, cared for, and cherished. Ethan had given me a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing, and as I finally drifted off to sleep, I knew that our relationship had changed forever. Where it would lead I couldn't say, but for now I was content to simply be in the moment with him.